You know, there's something Carl Jung discovered that shook the very foundations of how we understand God, and it's something most religious institutions have carefully avoided talking about for decades. It's not about denying faith or dismissing belief, but about understanding something far deeper, something that lives inside every single one of us, whether we're religious or not. Jung spent his entire life studying the human mind, and what he found was so profound, so revolutionary, that it challenged everything we thought we knew about divinity, about spirituality, and about the very nature of God himself. Let me take you back to a moment in Jung's life that changed everything. He was just a young boy, sitting in church with his father, who was a pastor. Everyone around him was praying, singing hymns, going through the motions of worship. But Jung felt nothing. He looked at his father and saw a man who seemed disconnected, performing rituals without truly experiencing the divine. That emptiness, that disconnect, haunted Jung for years. He couldn't understand how people could claim to have such a deep relationship with God when their lives showed no real transformation, no genuine encounter with something transcendent. This question became his life's work, and what he discovered was absolutely mind-blowing. Jung realized that God isn't just some external being sitting on a throne in the clouds, judging us from above. Instead, he discovered that what we call God is actually an archetype, a powerful symbol that lives in what he called the collective unconscious. Now, before you think this diminishes God or makes divinity less real, stay with me, because this is where it gets fascinating. Jung wasn't saying God doesn't exist. He was saying that our experience of God, our understanding of the divine, comes from the deepest layers of our psyche, from a place that connects all of humanity across time and culture. Every civilization, every culture throughout history has had some concept of a supreme being, a divine force, a creator. Why? Because this archetype is hardwired into the human psyche itself. Think about it for a moment. A child in ancient Egypt, a farmer in medieval Europe, a philosopher in ancient Greece, a shaman in the Amazon rainforest, they all developed concepts of God or gods without ever communicating with each other. They all created myths, stories, and rituals around divine beings. Jung asked the critical question that nobody else was asking. How is this possible if God is purely an external reality that must be taught? If God only existed outside of us, how would isolated cultures all arrive at similar divine concepts independently? His answer was revolutionary. The God image, the divine archetype, emerges from within us, from the collective unconscious that we all share as human beings. Now here's where religious institutions get uncomfortable. Jung discovered that when we project this inner archetype entirely outward, when we make God only an external authority figure, we actually disconnect from the genuine spiritual experience. We turn religion into rules, rituals, and dogma instead of a living, breathing encounter with the sacred. In his book, Answer to Job, Jung made one of his most controversial statements. He analyzed the biblical story of Job and concluded that the God portrayed in that story was morally incomplete, capable of cruelty and injustice. Jung wasn't trying to disrespect faith. He was pointing out that our images of God often reflect our own psychological projections, our own understanding of power, authority, morality, and justice. Religious institutions teach us that God is perfect, all-knowing, all-powerful, completely separate from human flaws. But Jung asked, if that's true, why does the God of the Old Testament display rage, jealousy, vengefulness, and favoritism? Why does God in the book of Job allow a righteous man to suffer terribly just to prove a point to Satan? Jung's answer was that these stories reveal something profound about the human psyche. They show us that what we call God is actually a reflection of the totality of the human experience, both light and shadow, both good and evil, both creation and destruction. The God image includes everything: the loving Father and the wrathful Judge, the Creator and the Destroyer, mercy and severity. This is what makes Jung's perspective so powerful and so threatening to traditional religious structures. He wasn't denying spiritual experience, he was actually validating it in a way that religion often fails to do. He was saying that when you have a genuine spiritual experience, when you feel connected to something greater than yourself, when you experience what mystics call union with the divine, you're actually encountering the deepest parts of your own psyche, the parts that connect you to all of humanity, to nature, to the cosmos itself. You're experiencing the self with a capital S, what Jung called the archetype of wholeness, the God within. Let me give you a concrete example of how this works in real life. Imagine someone who grows up in a strict religious household where God is presented as a punishing father figure, always watching, always judging, ready to condemn you for the smallest mistake. That person internalizes this God image, and it becomes part of their psychological structure. They live in fear, guilt, and shame. Their relationship with the divine is based on terror, not love. Now, according to traditional religion, this person just needs more faith, more prayer, more obedience. But according to Jung, this person needs to recognize that the punishing God image is actually a projection of their own inner critic, their own internalized authority figure, often based on their actual relationship with their parents. When this person begins to work with their unconscious, when they start to recognize these projections and integrate them, something remarkable happens. Their God image transforms. They begin to experience the divine not as an external judge, but as an inner source of wisdom, guidance, and unconditional acceptance. They realize that what they were calling God's punishment was actually their own self-rejection. What they were calling God's absence was actually their own disconnection from their authentic self. This is the process Jung called individuation, becoming whole by integrating all parts of ourselves, including our God image. Here's something most people don't know about Jung's personal spiritual journey. He had a series of powerful visions and dreams that convinced him of the reality of the psyche as something far more than just brain chemistry. In one famous vision, he saw God sitting on a golden throne high above the world, and then, to his absolute horror and fascination, he saw an enormous turd fall from beneath the throne and shatter a beautiful cathedral below. Now, you might think this was a blasphemous, offensive image, but for Jung it was a revelation. It showed him that the conventional, sanitized, perfect God image that religion presents actually needs to be shattered so that a more complete, more honest, more whole understanding of the divine can emerge. Jung realized that by making God entirely good, entirely light, entirely pure, religion creates a dangerous split. It forces us to deny and repress everything dark, everything shadow, everything messy about human existence. And what happens to everything we repress? It doesn't disappear. It goes into the unconscious and grows more powerful in the darkness. It emerges as neurosis, as addiction, as violence, as the very evil that religion claims to protect us from. Jung saw this pattern throughout history, how the most religious societies often produce the most horrific atrocities: the Inquisition, the Crusades, witch burnings, religious wars. Why? Because when we project all evil outward onto devils and demons and heretics, we never deal with the shadow within ourselves. In his book, Ion, Jung explored the symbolism of Christ and the Antichrist as representing this fundamental split in the Western psyche. Christ represents the light, the good, the pure, everything we aspire to be. The Antichrist represents the darkness, the evil, everything we reject and deny. But Jung argued that psychological wholeness requires integrating both, recognizing that we contain both Christ and Antichrist, both saint and sinner, both divine and demonic potentials. This doesn't mean acting on evil impulses, it means becoming conscious of them, owning them, and choosing consciously how to direct that energy. Think about someone you know who presents themselves as absolutely righteous, completely pure, holier than thou. What's your gut feeling about that person? Most of us instinctively distrust extreme displays of purity because we sense, often unconsciously, that wherever there's that much light on the surface, there must be an equal amount of shadow hidden underneath. And we see this proven again and again when religious leaders, politicians, or public figures who project absolute moral superiority get caught in scandalous behavior. The greater the persona of purity, the larger the hidden shadow. Jung offered a different path, radical honesty about our own darkness, conscious integration of our shadow, and a God image that includes the totality of existence, not just the sanitized, acceptable parts. He believed that Jesus himself understood this, which is why Jesus spent time with prostitutes, tax collectors, and sinners. Jesus didn't pretend evil didn't exist. He engaged with it consciously, with compassion, without being consumed by it. That's integration. That's wholeness. That's what Jung meant by the realization of the self. Now, here's where this gets really practical for your everyday life. How many times have you prayed for something, really prayed with all your heart, and felt like your prayers went nowhere? Traditional religion tells you that either God has a different plan, you didn't have enough faith, or you're being tested. But Jung would ask a different question. What is your unconscious trying to tell you? What are your dreams revealing? What symbols and synchronicities are appearing in your life? He believed that the psyche is constantly trying to communicate with us, trying to guide us toward wholeness, but we've been trained to ignore its language. Jung introduced the concept of synchronicity, meaningful coincidences that can't be explained by cause and effect. You think of someone you haven't spoken to in years, and they call you an hour later. You're struggling with a problem, and a stranger says something that gives you exactly the insight you needed. You keep seeing the same symbol or number everywhere you go. Traditional religion might call these signs from God, and Jung wouldn't necessarily disagree, but he'd say they're also messages from your own deeper self, from the collective unconscious, guiding you toward the path you need to take. Let me share a story that illustrates this perfectly. A patient came to Jung suffering from severe depression and meaninglessness. She was religious, prayed constantly, followed all the rules, but felt completely disconnected from any sense of purpose or divine presence. Jung didn't tell her to pray more or have more faith. Instead, he asked her to pay attention to her dreams. She started recording them, and a powerful recurring symbol emerged, a golden lion. Jung recognized this as an alchemical symbol of transformation, of integrating the powerful, instinctual, passionate parts of herself that she'd been taught to suppress in the name of being a good religious woman. Through working with this symbol, she began to reconnect with her own vitality, her own creative power, her own fierce, authentic self. And as she did this, her experience of the divine completely transformed. She no longer experienced God as a distant judge demanding obedience, but as a living presence within her own being, speaking through her dreams, her intuition, her deepest desires. She became spiritually alive in a way that years of conventional religious practice had never accomplished. That's the difference between religion as external dogma and spirituality as inner experience. Jung made a critical distinction that most people miss. He said that religion at its best is a system designed to protect people from direct experience of the divine. Because direct experience of the divine, what mystics call the numinous, is overwhelming, terrifying, and can shatter your entire sense of identity. Religion provides rituals, prayers, priests, intermediaries, all designed to make the experience of the sacred manageable, safe, domesticated. But in doing so, religion often kills the very experience it's supposed to facilitate. It turns the living God into a concept, a doctrine, a set of beliefs you're supposed to accept without question. This is why every major religious tradition has a mystical branch that the mainstream institution views with suspicion. Christianity has the mystics like Meister Eckhart and St. John of the Cross. Islam has the Sufis. Judaism has the Kabbalists. Buddhism has Zen. Hinduism has the Vedanta teachers. These mystical traditions all point to the same truth that Jung discovered through psychology. The divine is not separate from you, it's the deepest reality of what you are. As Meister Eckhart said, the eye through which I see God is the same eye through which God sees me. That's pure Jung, centuries before Jung was born. But here's the paradox that Jung wrestled with his entire life. If God is an archetype within the psyche, does that mean God is just a creation of the human mind? Is Jung reducing God to psychology? Jung's answer was subtle and profound. He said that calling something psychological doesn't make it less real, it actually reveals where and how it's real. We experience God psychologically, through our consciousness, through our dreams, through our inner life. That's where God becomes real for us, not through intellectual beliefs or external rituals, but through inner experience. Jung once said, "I don't believe in God, I know God." What did he mean by that? He meant that his experience of the numinous, of the self, of the transcendent function of the psyche was so direct, so undeniable, that it wasn't a matter of belief or faith, it was experiential knowledge. And that's what he wanted to give back to people, not another belief system to adopt, but a path to direct experience, to genuine encounter with the sacred dimension of their own being. Think about your own life for a moment. When have you felt most connected to something greater than yourself? Was it in a church, following prescribed rituals? Maybe it was, and that's beautiful. But for many people, those moments come in nature. Watching a sunset, holding a newborn baby, creating art, making love, facing death, experiencing profound loss. These are the moments when the ego cracks open and we touch something vast, something eternal, something that feels like coming home to a reality we'd forgotten. Jung would say those are genuine religious experiences, whether they happen in a temple or on a mountaintop. Now, let's address something that might be bothering you. Does Jung's perspective undermine faith? Does it mean religious people are just projecting their psychology and there's nothing real beyond that? Here's what Jung actually believed, and this is crucial. He thought that the psyche itself is mysterious, that the unconscious extends far beyond the personal, connecting to something transpersonal, something that might indeed be divine in origin. He never claimed to know what God is in himself, beyond human experience. He only claimed to know how humans experience God, through the archetypes of the collective unconscious. In other words, Jung left room for mystery. He left room for something beyond psychology. He just insisted that whatever God is in ultimate reality, we experience that reality through the medium of the psyche, and therefore understanding the psyche is essential to understanding our relationship with the divine. You can be a committed Christian, Muslim, Jew, Hindu, Buddhist, and still benefit enormously from Jung's insights, because he's not asking you to abandon your faith. He's asking you to make it conscious, to understand the psychological dimensions of your spiritual experience, to integrate your shadow so your faith becomes more whole, more authentic, more transformative. Here's a practical application that shows the power of Jung's approach. Many people struggle with prayer because they imagine God as completely other, completely separate up there, while they're down here. So prayer becomes like shouting into a void, hoping someone's listening. But if you understand God as Jung did, as an archetype that includes both the transcendent dimension beyond us and the immanent dimension within us, prayer transforms. It becomes a dialogue with the deepest part of yourself, the part connected to all being, the part that Jung called the self. Your prayers become conversations with your own wisdom, your own inner guide, which is simultaneously beyond you and within you. This doesn't make prayer less powerful, it makes it more powerful because you're not trying to convince an external deity to change his mind about his cosmic plan. You're aligning your conscious ego with the deeper wisdom of the self, opening yourself to guidance that's already present, waiting to be heard. You're engaging in what Jung called active imagination, conscious dialogue with the unconscious. And this practice can be profoundly transformative, more transformative than years of rote prayers that never touch the heart. Jung also had fascinating things to say about religious symbols and why they're losing their power in the modern world. He noticed that as society became more rational, more scientific, more materialistic, religious symbols stopped resonating with people's inner experience. The cross, the virgin birth, the resurrection, communion, all these powerful symbols that once carried tremendous psychological energy started feeling like empty rituals or intellectual puzzles to be believed without understanding. Why did this happen? Because we stopped engaging with these symbols as living realities speaking to the unconscious and started treating them as historical facts to be defended or attacked. Jung believed that every religious symbol contains profound psychological truth. The virgin birth, for example, isn't primarily about a biological miracle, it's about the birth of the self, the divine child, from the virgin unconscious, untouched by ego consciousness. The crucifixion represents the death of the ego, the necessary suffering that comes with transformation. The resurrection represents the emergence of the integrated self after the ego has been sacrificed. When you understand these symbols psychologically, they become alive again. They speak to your actual experience of growth, death, and rebirth in your own life. Let me give you another real-life example. Someone loses their job, their identity, everything they thought defined them. From a purely external perspective, it's a tragedy, a disaster. But from a Jungian perspective, it might be the psyche's way of forcing an ego death, destroying an old identity so a truer, more authentic self can emerge. If that person understands this process symbolically as a kind of crucifixion and resurrection happening in their own life, they can work with it consciously instead of just being a victim of circumstances. They can ask, what part of me needs to die? What new self is trying to be born? What is the meaning of this suffering? This is what Jung meant by saying that the symbols of religion are actually maps of psychological transformation. The hero's journey, death and rebirth, sacrifice and redemption, fall and redemption. These aren't just stories about external gods and heroes. They're stories about the journey every human soul must take toward wholeness. They're encoded wisdom about how transformation happens, how we grow, how we integrate shadow, how we encounter the divine within. Now, here's something that might surprise you about Jung's relationship with Christianity specifically. Despite his criticisms, despite his radical reinterpretation of Christian symbols, Jung actually believed Christianity contained profound psychological wisdom. But he thought the church had largely lost touch with that wisdom, reducing the living Christ to a doctrine, the transformative process to a belief system. He was especially critical of Christianity's rejection of the feminine, the body, and the earth, seeing this as a dangerous imbalance that created enormous psychological problems in Western culture. Jung spent years studying alchemy, and he discovered that the medieval alchemists were actually practicing a form of depth psychology centuries before Freud and Jung. When they talked about turning lead into gold, they weren't primarily talking about physical metals. They were describing the psychological process of transforming the base, unconscious aspects of the personality into conscious gold, the realization of the self. The alchemical marriage, The union of king and queen, sun and moon, represents the integration of masculine and feminine within the psyche. The philosopher's stone, the goal of the alchemical process, is the self, the God image within. Why did these alchemists hide their psychological wisdom in chemical metaphors? Because the church would have condemned them as heretics if they'd spoken openly about the God within, about transformation through inner work rather than through sacraments and priests. So they disguised their spiritual psychology as chemistry, and in doing so, they preserved ancient wisdom about the psyche that the church had tried to suppress. Jung saw himself as recovering and translating this lost wisdom for the modern world. Here's where Jung's work becomes especially relevant for our current moment in history. We're living in a time when traditional religion is declining rapidly in the West, when many people call themselves spiritual but not religious, when there's a hunger for meaning and transcendence, but also deep skepticism about organized religion. Jung offers a bridge, a way to access the wisdom and transformative power of religious symbols without requiring belief in supernatural doctrines that modern people find difficult to accept. You can work with dreams, with active imagination, with symbols, with the journey of individuation, and experience genuine spiritual transformation without joining a church or accepting a creed. At the same time, if you are religious, Jung's work can deepen your faith immeasurably by helping you understand the psychological reality behind your beliefs, making them living, experiential truths rather than abstract doctrines. But we need to address the elephant in the room. If Jung is right, if God is primarily an archetype within the collective unconscious, what happens to objective morality? What happens to the idea that some things are truly good and others truly evil, not just psychologically but metaphysically? This is where Jung's perspective requires real intellectual honesty. He didn't believe in simple, absolute answers. He believed that what we call good and evil are aspects of the totality of existence, and our task isn't to destroy evil, but to become conscious of it, to integrate it, to transform it. This doesn't mean anything goes, that there's no morality. Jung believed deeply in the reality of evil and the necessity of moral choice. But he thought that true morality comes from consciousness, from understanding your shadow and choosing not to act it out, rather than from external commandments you follow without understanding. A person who is unconscious of their shadow can follow all the rules and still cause tremendous harm. A person who has integrated their shadow can break conventional rules and act from genuine compassion and wisdom. Think about this in practical terms. Which is more moral? The person who never steals because they believe God will punish them, or the person who doesn't steal because they've deeply understood the suffering theft causes and genuinely don't want to create that suffering? The first person is following external morality out of fear. The second person has internalized morality through consciousness. Jung believed the second path is higher, more genuinely ethical, because it comes from understanding rather than obedience. This brings us to one of Jung's most controversial ideas, the idea that God himself is evolving, becoming more conscious through human consciousness. In answer to Job, Jung suggested that the incarnation of Christ represents God's attempt to experience human suffering, to become conscious of the effects of his own power, to evolve beyond the amoral archetypal force depicted in the Old Testament. This idea scandalized religious people because it implies God is not perfect, not complete, not all-knowing from the beginning. But Jung asked a challenging question. If God is already perfect and complete, why creation? Why the long, painful evolution of consciousness? Why does the Bible itself show a clear development in how God is understood, from tribal war god to universal father? Jung proposed that consciousness itself is the meaning of existence, that we are the organs through which the unconscious God becomes conscious, through which the universe comes to know itself. Our psychological and spiritual development isn't just about us. It's about the evolution of consciousness itself, the God process unfolding through time. Now, this might sound abstract and philosophical, but it has immediate practical implications. It means your life matters cosmically, not because a God outside you has a plan for you, but because you are part of the process through which consciousness emerges from unconsciousness, through which meaning emerges from chaos, through which the divine becomes real in the world. Every time you make something unconscious conscious, every time you integrate a piece of your shadow, every time you choose awareness over reaction, you're participating in the fundamental task of existence itself. Let me bring this to a close with a final story that captures the essence of Jung's vision. Late in his life, Jung was asked by an interviewer if he believed in God. Jung paused for a long moment and then said, "I don't need to believe, I know." The interviewer pressed him, "You know God exists?" And Jung replied, "I know. I don't need to believe, I know." What he meant was that his experience of the numinous, of the self, of the transcendent reality that lives within the psyche was so direct, so undeniable, that belief was irrelevant. He had encountered something real, something that transformed his life and gave it meaning. And whether you call that God or the self or the collective unconscious, it's the most important reality there is. This is Carl Jung's hidden truth about God, the truth that religion often misses and sometimes actively suppresses. God is not primarily out there, distant and separate, demanding belief and obedience. God is also in here, the deepest reality of your own being, the self that connects you to all existence, the source of wisdom, meaning, and transformation that speaks through dreams, through synchronicities, through the symbols that move your soul. The journey isn't about believing harder or following more rules. It's about going inward, facing your shadow, integrating your wholeness, and in doing so, encountering the divine that was there all along, waiting to be discovered. This is Carl Jung's perspective, a view that challenges conventional religious thinking while opening a doorway to genuine spiritual experience. It's not the only truth, and it's certainly not a truth that everyone will accept. But it's a perspective worth understanding, worth questioning, worth testing against your own experience. In this video, my goal isn't to tell you what to believe about God. It's to present Jung's revolutionary ideas as an intellectual provocation, an invitation to think more deeply about consciousness, about spirituality, about the nature of the divine and where we encounter it. At the end of the day, each person must decide for themselves what resonates as true. Jung's work provides tools, insights, and a framework for exploring the depths of your own psyche and discovering what lives there. Whether you see that as purely psychological or as a pathway to something transcendent and divine is ultimately your choice. The invitation is simply to go deeper, to become more conscious, to engage with the mystery of existence, not through belief alone, but through direct experience and honest self-exploration. So I want to know, what's your perspective on this? Does Jung's view resonate with your experience, or does it feel like something essential is missing? Have you had experiences that felt genuinely spiritual, genuinely transcendent? And where did those experiences come from? Drop your thoughts in the comments, share this video if it sparked something in you, and subscribe if you want to keep exploring these deep questions about psychology, spirituality, and what it means to be human. The journey continues, and every perspective, every question, every honest exploration brings us closer to understanding the mystery we're all part of.